So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just giving it a couple of seconds while everybody joins us because we have over 150 people registered. So just takes a few seconds to get everybody in and then we'll start. Okay, let us get underway. So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at the key developments in and around the European Union in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, are Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the EPC, and Chief Executive Fabian Zuleeg. And our guest this week, joining us a bit later on, Ricardo Borges de Castro, the EPC's Associate Director and Head of Europe in the World Programme. As we discuss, first we're going to focus on what I might call breaking news. So the recent developments in relation to COVID-19, the Conference on the Future of Europe, and the latest twists in the never-ending saga that is the EU-UK relationship. And then we're going to focus in the second half with Ricardo on what the EU needs to do to respond to what the EPC has dubbed in a new publication, the age of the perma-crisis. As always, totally interactive discussion, questions from me first, and then later on from all of you. To that end, you are all muted for now. If you want to join in the conversation later on, click on the raise hand buttons if you want to speak, and I will allow you to talk at the appropriate moment. At that point, unmute yourself, don't put on your camera, we'll just hear from you. So if you're watching us in your jimmy jammies, we won't know about it. And if you want to write your question, can you please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box, and please, as always, a plea. Please be brief so I can see what your question is and who it's for at a glance. So let's get underway. And Janis, perhaps I could start with you on the question of COVID-19 and particularly, first of all, the vaccine rollout. Still a lot of criticism about the speed at which it's happening in many member states. There's been a lot of discussion about why it's so painfully slow, more arguments about how it's being distributed. And this week we saw Italy criticised for deciding to ban the export of 250,000 vaccines to Australia. What is your take on where we are? And are the problems we're now seeing still to do with the procurement of the vaccine, or is this much more to do with the way member states are organising the distribution and the giving of the vaccines?
Well, it has to do with both. What we're seeing is that there is a speeding up of the rollout. It's very slowly speeding up, and it's obviously much behind what the original expectations were when the rollout started end of last year. But at least there is a positive trend. We're also seeing that there are increasing differences between member states. So if you look into the numbers, you will see that some member states are progressing better than others. That doesn't mean that the former are progressing well, but they are progressing better than others, which is a clear indication that you also have a good number of national reasons which play into why some member states are doing better and others are still lagging behind. So there are multiple reasons. You see that Malta is doing much better than the rest, but it's a small country, it's an island, so probably that also obviously helps. You see that other countries like Belgium, unfortunately, is lagging behind compared to also similar sized countries like Greece or others. So there are also particular national reasons which play into this. What you're also seeing is that we have an increasing pressure in the member states to reduce the lockdown. There is an increasing fatigue, crisis fatigue. Governments are under pressure to soften the lockdown, and we see that in many member states where this is the case, that they are starting to do that, and they're doing it against the advice of many of the epidemiologists who are saying we haven't progressed far enough in order to reduce the measures which have been imposed because of the lockdown. So there is a change of strategy because there's this expectation that in a couple of weeks' time, next quarter, the situation will improve. And that's, I think, a hope, which we'll see whether that will materialize.
And just going back on the vaccines for a moment, there was a lot of furore about the Italian decision on the export of vaccines to Australia. But the EU has been, despite its own problems in having enough vaccine, has been exporting millions of doses. So I mean, do you think the criticism of Italy was justified? The Commission has backed it up. Why did they do it? And is this problematic, do you think, for the EU's claim to also be, it's not my country first or my EU first. We really need to help the developed and the developing world across the world get access. Was it a storm in a teacup or a genuine and important argument?
I think in many ways it was a storm in a teacup, because we're talking about 250,000 doses to be exported to Australia. So that is not a huge number. What we now know, and that is where the new measures have allowed us to have much more transparency, at least, that around or more than 34 million doses have been exported to outside the EU over the past months. So 250,000 is not that large of an amount, but it is a signal. It's signaling to AstraZeneca and to others, be aware, we have an instrument which we can actually use. We're not only using it in order to increase the pressure and transparency, we're actually also ready to use it. And you said the Commission backed the decision which the Italian government took. But let's not also forget the decision of the Italian government, of the Draghi government, was also motivated strongly by politics, because it is sending a signal also in internal Italian politics. Look, we are defending the Italian interest. We are being tough on the companies which have created a problem. So it is also a move which the Draghi government has used to strengthen its position as it has come into office. So there is also a lot of politics behind it. But I think the big news is actually how much we are exporting to the outside world from EU member states. And what is it telling us with respect to comparing ourselves to the UK or to the US? And I think that is sending a message which is not only a message which is strongly received within the member states, but I think it's also a message which is going beyond the EU 27, saying, look, we are also thinking of not only ourselves, we're also thinking of others, and we actually are open, whereas you are not, other players.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of politics here.
And on that point, Fabian, please do react to what Janis was saying, but on that point, one of the sources of fresh arguments between the UK and the EU this week has been about whether, as Charles Michel claimed, the UK is banning exports of vaccines. The UK reacted with fury. Beautiful little irony, though, wanted to summon the EU ambassador to have a dressing down for these comments. But of course, as they won't recognise the EU ambassador as an EU ambassador, that was a little bit tricky. So the deputy ambassador, the chargé d'affaires, went. But this argument with the UK over vaccines, as Janis was pointing out, the EU has exported a lot, the UK has not, and yet the UK is now trying to claim the moral high ground here. How do you see that? Is this just a pawn in the saga of EU-UK relations post-Brexit?
Well, I think certainly it's a symptom of what is happening in the relationship. It doesn't necessarily have to be vaccines. It could be a number of other things. And I think in part the reaction on both sides can also be explained by the deterioration or the continuation of the deterioration of the relationship. That there is very little trust. There is very little effective cooperation. Yes, we have the agreement in place. Well, we have the agreement provisionally in place, because even that at the moment is in question. But in reality, there were always going to be a number of areas where there are shared interests, there are shared challenges, and where the way forward would be about having a cooperative conversation about this. And that is not happening at the moment.
And indeed, most strikingly, on the Northern Ireland Protocol, we had the decision by the UK last week, a unilateral decision to extend the grace period for a range of checks on trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. This has now prompted the EU to, they're planning legal action. I'm not sure we know the precise form of that legal action. Does the UK have a point at all? It says the EU was not constructively engaging in finding solutions. This is the only solution for now. But there is a fear on the EU side that this suggests that Boris Johnson signed up to all these things, never having any intention of implementing them. And we will see extension after extension, and therefore effectively uncertainty and chaos for as long as to come. Who's right about this?
Well, firstly, I would go back to my previous point. It shows how little trust and cooperation there is. So we're not actually sitting down and saying, okay, there are problems, there are things which need to be sorted out. But we're having essentially a debate in the public, in the media, where both sides are essentially claiming they are right. Now, in this particular case, I think there's a very clear implication here that what the UK is intending to do is not to honor the legal documents they have signed. And it has to be said, the UK also has form for this. It's not the first time this is threatened. I think the question in the end will be whether when we get to the real enforcement, whether the UK will back down or not. I think it's highly unlikely that the UK will risk the whole relationship. But I think we are going to be in a situation where this continual conflict, this continual rubbing against each other, will be a feature of the relationship for the foreseeable future.
And if I could just follow up on that, I mean, in terms of some way of cooling tempers, I know the EPC is working on this issue. You have a special project devoted to it, but is there a way, despite the lack of the loss of trust, the bad temper, the bad feeling, is there a way of getting back on track? Or do you subscribe to those who say, actually, there isn't, because this is a deliberate UK government strategy that in order to cover up for the fact that Brexit is causing the sort of disruption that those on the Remain side argued would happen, they are seeking to stoke up tension, stoke up row, so they can keep saying, well, it's the EU's fault because they're so intransigent. And if it is a deliberate strategy, then there's nothing to be done to rebuild the relationship. Do you see, and I'll bring in John Kerr after this, I'd be interested to hear, he's raised his hand. Do you see voices of sanity, if you like, on the UK side saying, no, we do need to get back to something? I mean, no one expected it to be quite this bad quite so soon, did they?
Well, some people expected that it would not be an easy relationship, also because the price for getting a deal was that the UK government had to accept a number of things which they had publicly said they would never accept. So I think, yes, it is right that some of this is a deliberate attempt by the UK government to detract from the kind of commitments which they have actually signed. But I think we have to be pragmatic. We have to say that there are many issues where we can also make progress. We also have to recognize that the UK is not the UK government. We are talking about a wide range of actors, and we need to also engage with different actors on some of these issues. And I think we have to, in some way, be normative as well. And we have to say there are some issues where we have no choice, and we have to find a solution. When it comes to Northern Ireland, it is a joint responsibility between the EU and the UK to make sure that we find a workable solution. So we have to also have that very delicate balance between, yes, sticking to our principle, making sure that we are not taken for a ride, but on the other hand, we also have to be sure that we're doing whatever is pragmatically possible and that we are willing to compromise to be able to calm the situation down. But it's not going to be easy, and it's going to be a difficult relationship for a number of years to come.
Thank you. Let me just bring in John Kerr at this point, because I'd be interested to get his perspective. And of course, John, whatever you wanted to ask. Hello there. John, can you unmute yourself?
I hope I have.
Yes. Hello, sir. How are you?
Thank you very much, Jacki. I agree with everything that Fabian has just said. I myself thought that the relationship would always start rather rebarbatively, because we, the British, when we started to feel the pain of being outside the customs union single market, we would not blame ourselves, we would blame our friends. And it seems to me that that is what is happening now. My question actually is a technical question, but it goes to the heart of how we rebuild trust. Am I right, Fabian, in thinking that if the ratification of the new treaty is now further delayed because of the European Parliament's reaction to our unilateral action on the grace period, if it's further delayed, does that mean that the institutional structure, the many committees that are designed to deal with the loose ends and to broaden the relationship, does that mean that all that structure stays in abeyance until the treaty is ratified? In which case, I foresee a real risk of a downward spiral if there is no, if the forums which are meant to deal with the problems of being outside single market, of course you can't deal with all of them, but ameliorations are possible and so on. If these fora don't exist because the treaty doesn't exist, then how do we get out of here?
Thank you, John. Do we know the answer to that, Fabian? Is everything in abeyance until the Parliament does its business? And as John was indicating, having indicated this week, they're not going to hurry because of what the UK has now done.
I would make the distinction between what is happening politically and what might be legally possible. I think the difficulty is that in this period of uncertainty, very little of that behind the scenes work is going to start, regardless of whether you have the institutional structure there, whether you have the committees there. Because in essence, everyone is waiting to see whether we will even have an agreement to work with. Because in the end, if there is a real impasse, as I said, I think the UK will back down at some point in time, but there is a possibility that the UK does not back down, in which case the Parliament will not ratify the TCA, and then the whole construction collapses, and we're going back to the structures which we have in the withdrawal agreement, because we shouldn't forget that that has been signed, and unless we have the TCA in place, that is what will be the determinant for the relationship. But I think in the end, and also I might be disagreeing a little bit with John here, I think the difficulty is that, yes, we can try to technicalize the relationship. We try to work through these things. But if the overarching political will isn't there from either side to make this work, if things are getting politicized at every corner, then these technical means are not going to work.
And indeed,
unfortunately where we are.
Yeah, if you maintain such a heated debate in the UK, if you keep stoking up feelings among Brexiteers and others, then it makes the climate for de-escalation more difficult. I see a question. I don't know whether it's Brexit related, but I'll take it in case it is. And then I want to move on to the conference on the future of Europe from Jenny. Forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Jenichiro Jacki. If you could unmute yourself and please pronounce your name correctly, because I'm sure I just made a mess of it. You need to unmute yourselves. Not happening at the moment. Okay, let's move on, and I will come back if you can find a way to unmute yourself after that. Let's turn our attention to the conference on the future of Europe. Okay, we've had the big moment. We've had the signing of the joint declaration. We are now officially underway. But just tell me, Janis, your perception now, when you see what's been agreed, of just what that tells us about how important the conference is going to be and what it's likely, if anything, to deliver. I mean, I must confess, I'm utterly baffled by the structure of this thing, with the the presidents of the EU institutions as presidents, an executive board, a common secretariat, conference plenaries, national events, and then decision making, it appears, by consensus. I mean, it appears that because they couldn't agree, they've decided to sort of do all of the above. And my question really is, does that mean we should be very concerned that this exercise will prove to be fairly meaningless, or can some of these initial obstacles be overcome? Are you still an optimist? Because I know you've believed all along this is a very important and necessary effort. Are you still optimistic it can be made to work?
Well, first of all, if you believe that this is something which has a certain significance, doesn't mean that you, by nature, need to be an optimist about it. I think what, first of all, is important is that we got the joint declaration finally signed. There was a long delay, which also means that we lost time in terms of the deliberations of the conference, because it will still end at the same point, which is the spring of 2022. Second, we created a lot of frustrations. A lot of people are asking themselves, and skepticism, are asking themselves, what will this conference be about? Will it make a difference? And, you know, this saga has dragged on for so long, so that also, you know, some who in the beginning had some positive sentiments about it, in the meantime have come to the conclusion, well, it won't work. So the fact that we finally have signed the joint declaration, I think, is good news. However, if you look into the joint declaration, there are a lot of gaps. There are a lot of things which are not clarified, or things which have been mechanically done in a way which don't make sense. So if you look at, you mentioned the governance structure of the conference. Well, the governance structure of the conference is the result of the infights which we had between the institutions. The European Parliament had a different view about what the conference should be about. It also had an idea who should be leading it, which created controversies with the Council. In the Council, you have a lot of member states who actually do not want this conference to happen. They don't think that it's the right time to have a conference, and they fear that it might lead to something which is anathema, which is treaty change. So the outcome of the joint declaration is the result of all those forces which are undermining the process, and that is not a good start.
But it means nothing from what you're saying. Nothing has been resolved, because all three institutions are presidents. Then there's an executive board with a secretariat. Has anything? Do they start with any agreement on really what the scope is, except for a long list, and how they're going to, what does decision making by consensus really mean? Or are they just going to go on arguing about this all the way through the process?
Well, first of all, a framework has been set, and that is important. And the fact that the conference, which, by the way, the name conference already is misguiding, because it's a process which will end at some point in next year. And that process is complicated. And now you have a framework in which the conference will be operating. But there are these gaps. And we are about to publish a paper which we have called Mind the Gaps, and saying what are the biggest gaps. One of the gaps is the governance structure of the conference. So I believe that the executive board, which would be the highest executive body of the conference, should clarify what its internal rules will be. Because, as you said, if everything will be decided by consensus, does that mean that you will actually have decisions, or will we have stalemate and the lowest or the very lowest common denominator? So let the executive board find an agreement on how it actually will agree on things when it has to call the shots. But there are other gaps which the joint declaration has not clarified. The list of issues to be covered is far too long. They should limit themselves to a number of strategic priorities. We have identified what they should be more than a year ago. We have a link between the citizens and the representative dimension with the conference plenary, where there's a lot of uncertainty. So you need to clarify of how many times will it meet, how will it work, who will be participating in it. These things still need to be clarified. And I think that's something which is going to be among the first tasks of the executive board. And I can go on and mentioning deficits of the joint declaration. But again, I think it's good that we get the thing started. We're going to have it. So let's try to make the best out of it. And all those who are now saying, well, it's not worth having, I think we should invest more energy into saying and asking ourselves, how can we make the best out of that, instead of starting from the beginning? It doesn't matter, it won't make a difference, because it will happen. And by the way, it can also do harm if at the end it is a big failure.
Indeed. And one question, of course, that remains open, because the declaration leaves it up to member states to decide how much to do in terms of genuine citizen debates at national level, at regional level. It's supposed to be a citizens' dialogue, a debate with the public, but they leave that question open. But Fabian, give Fabian a chance just to comment. There's a question from the floor, and then I'll come back, Janis, before we move on. But Fabian, your take on where we are now, and whether you think, looking at it glass half full, Janis says at least we are underway, we have a structure, and it's important, versus my slightly more cynical take.
Well, I think broadly I agree with Janis. yes, if you ask yourself the questions, how do we get to a meaningful debate, then you probably would say, well, we wouldn't start here. But that's where we are. I think the signal which would go out if we don't take it seriously, if we don't do something with it now, would be a lot worse. Because in essence, you would be telling the citizens that the only reason why we threw that in the mix was because there was some political debate at the time which demanded it, and now we will ignore it. I think that's a very dangerous message to put out there. So I think we have to do what we can to make it meaningful. And I think this is also something where civil society in general can contribute something to that. I think this is now a question of, in a way, also taking it a bit out of the hands of the politicians and saying, now is the time when, yes, we want citizens' engagement, but we also need to have those organizations which are closer to the citizens becoming involved in this and demanding that they have a voice in this, demanding the kind of things that they want to see in the debate, and telling their politicians that they have expectations which they want to see fulfilled.
And linked to that point, the point I was making about it's up to member states to decide how to organize citizens' dialogue. So we have a question from Stefan Lutgenau, who says consultations with civil society and citizens are very much nationalized by the EU and member states. Who will bring the transnational perspective into the participative process? So not just within countries, but between citizens in different countries. Do you envisage now, under the structure we've got, that actually happening?
Well, I think that there's a structural flaw in the construction of the conference, which relates to the link between the national and the subnational and the transnational dimension. I'm not so much worried about the transnational deliberations. There will be European transnational citizens panels, which will be discussing different issues, bringing together citizens from different member states. The problem is, if you only have a transnational discussion, which is very Brussels focused, and you don't really have a national debate about the issues which are of concern of people, and that link these national or even local, so it's also the subnational level, the regional level. If you don't foster these debates within the member states and then try to see how you're going to progress from there on to the transnational level, you have a missing link. But there's a reason for that. And the reason was that the member states, as I said earlier, were not so much interested in the conference. Those who wanted it, the Germans, the French, who were pushing, some of the rotating presidencies, like the Portuguese, who have been pushing, they did not want to push their fellow member states and fellow governments further when it comes to the national discussions, deliberations, because they felt that they were not willing to do so, and so they were not ready to provide a framework in which national and subnational discussions would happen. So now we have a situation where member states can do whatever they want. Some will do a very good job, like the Irish and others, and some won't. We don't even have a mechanism to monitor what will happen at national level and to improve it. I think that's a deep structural flaw, which you can do something about it, but you need to do something about it now. And I think that's another thing the executive board should concentrate on.
Thank you very much. Jenny Chiro, Jacki, I wanted to have one more go at coming back to you, if you can unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'm just looking to see if that happens. Can you hear me? Otherwise, I'm going to go to John Palmer, and then we're going to move on. I'm going to bring Ricardo in to talk about the age of the perma crisis. John Palmer. Good afternoon, John. Hang on. Sorry, I think that's my fault. John, try again. Hello?
Okay.
Hi, John.
Now?
Yep.
I really want to follow up the last two contributions that Janis and Fabian made. Looking at it from the other end of the telescope, what are the concrete issues I define as susceptible to meaningful decision at a Conference of Future of Europe level, which a priori reflect clear popular interest? I mean, one obvious one would be health, the Europeanization of the experience, negative and positive, that we've been through. Guessing, I think, maybe around the young, mobility, learning, etc. Is there any, what I'm trying to ask is there any merit in trying to focus the other end of the telescope to suggest concrete areas where a constructive development is possible.
Janis, let me come back to you on that, because in the commentary that you're preparing with your colleague, Karina Stratolat, you talk about this long list and how it needs to be boiled down to some strategic priorities. Because if you talk about everything, you talk about nothing effectively. Is John right in suggesting that you should drive this through the things the public would care about most? He talked about health and youth and mobility. How do you identify what the strategic priorities should be? And
Well,
then Fabian, and then we'll bring Ricardo in. Okay.
I think that you obviously need to deal with the issues which people are interested most. And health obviously is one issue. But there are also others. And I think that what we really need to concentrate on are the issues which are of a transformational nature, the things which will change the way we will be living in future. So health, I think, even when we get over COVID-19, this is not the end of the story. But there are issues related to sustainability, the green Europe, let's call it, issue, which I think is something which people are interested in, especially also the younger generation. Think of Friday demonstrations before COVID broke out. There are issues related to digital transformation, technological revolutions which are ahead, which people care about because they fear that this might also have consequences for their jobs, for the lives they will be and the work they will be doing in future. Then we have global developments which are very unstable and uncertain, where we need to ask ourselves how we want to position ourselves. And by the way, we also have the future of democracy, of European democracy and beyond, which I think is something which we need to discuss, including the rule of law, but also how we involve citizens in policy making in future. So I think that there are a number of issues we need to discuss. And I think that it would be wise to start the conference, especially as we have to start it online, with having a citizens panel asking them, which are the issues you want to concentrate on?
What do you want to talk about?
And what are the key questions you want to address?
Absolutely.
And the more we can limit that, the more meaningful the conference process could be.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Fabian.
I agree with that, but I would also add a note of caution to it, that I think there's a big danger that we could end up with a big expectation capability gap, that citizens raise a number of issues which they think are very important, but that the member states or the institutions, for whatever reason, do not want to have that dealt with at the European level. I think it is perfectly legitimate to say there are certain things we don't want to do at the European level, but I think the worst experience for citizens to be involved in an exercise like this one is to feel that what they are suggesting in the end is being ignored. So we should also be honest and say that if there are issues which we are not going to deal with, which are not on the table, there is no point in then having a big discussion around it, which can only lead to disappointed expectations.
Thank you very much. I want to link this now to the conversation we're going to have about the age of the permacrisis. Ricardo, a very warm welcome to you. Great to have you back.
Thank you.
And I'm linking it because when you talk, the three of you have written published today by the EPC, where you talk about the age of the permacrisis. And one of the things you say the Conference of Europe should be discussing is what the implications are of an age of permacrisis for the way the EU runs itself, for what it does. But could I just start by finding out what it is we're actually talking about, Ricardo? What do you mean when you talk about the age of permacrisis?
Thank you, Jackie. Great to be with all of you. I mean, I think the central premise of our argument is that the volatility, the uncertainty, even the fragility that we are experiencing today is likely to endure even when we have COVID behind our backs. Not only because COVID will certainly leave tail effects, on the economy, on the political systems that will last for longer. Also because, COVID has not only accelerated certain trends, but has actually sharpened others that are already there, such as, inequalities, competition among great powers. We were just discussing it previously on sort of this issue of vaccines. So, we see this heightened competition, and what we anticipate is that this is likely, this atmosphere, this more inhospitable, atmosphere surrounding us and even internally is likely to endure. So, this is the diagnosis, but there is also a prescription. And the prescription should not lead us, to paralysis. I mean, this does not mean that this is a fatality or that this is a foregone conclusion. There are things that we can do, so we can change. So this is more of a call to action. And I think we'll have the opportunity to discuss that as well. And finally, I think there is an underlying idea in the whole paper that I invite everyone to read, which is the sense of urgency. We need to prepare for this now. So, we shouldn't waste more time. And this is basically the context that we believe that we will be operating in, at least in the foreseeable future. And maybe it does not have to be as difficult if we actually start preparing now. Maybe we'll be able to avoid some of these more negative consequences if we start now in this age of permacrisis.
And just picking up on that point about the call to action, and you talk about changing EU instruments, EU mechanisms to ensure that it can cope with permanent crisis and different crises coming up at different times, old crises resurging and so on. Where do you think, what sort of innovations are we talking about? It seems to me a lot of them have to do with your ability to plan, to see what's coming up, and a lot of them have to do with your agility. Flexibility, speed of decision making. What sort of things do you focus on?
I would go for my sort of my apple, which is the strategic foresight, and I would say that, of course, we are already doing. The EU is already doing more than it was in the past, but we need to do much more. And we need to really try to establish within our institutions, stronger mechanisms of strategic foresight, and not only in the institutions, at the member states level. This is happening. It's happening progressively, but we need to do more. I fear, because some of these instruments are not visible. You are not making a fuss out of them. There might not be political attention, or there might not be resources because of all the things that we will need to solve because of corona crisis. But certainly, when the next crisis hit, or in the perma crisis environment, when they are not there, you will miss them. You will say again.
But you won't know you're going to miss them until you get to it. So it's that anticipation. Fabian, you wanted to come in here, and in terms of how the EU's decision-making processes need to adapt. So we heard there Ricardo talking about the anticipation, the foresight element. What other sorts of innovations do we need to cope with this new age?
There are a range of different things, and I think the key here is to also look back at what we can learn from the experience over the crisis which have hit us, because we shouldn't forget that in one way or the other, we're now talking about almost 15 years, maybe even you could expand it if you go back to 9/11. We're talking about 20 years of permanent crisis. And when you are in a crisis situation, you have to be able to react differently. For example, you have to be able to take decisive action. You have to, if we think back to the Euro crisis, the bazooka, we'll do whatever it takes. It is that kind of action which you will have to take to stop a crisis from spiraling out of control. So it's developing these mechanisms to be able to have the contingency, to have the ability to react, but then also to be able to do it and not to have the long time delays which often characterize decision making. But I would make a more general point as well, that this is not just about the European Union. We have focused specifically on the European Union because that's the area we work on. But if our diagnosis is right, that this is the world we're living in, there are lessons here for decision makers at all levels, because they will have to react to these crises as well. So this is not a call for the European Union doing everything, or the European Union being the only body which is affected by this. This is about the world we are going to be living in, and how we best react to that, so that policy can be effective in addressing the challenges.
And Janis, do you see COVID-19 as a moment of opportunity, in the sense that it has underlined the need for some of this agility, for ways of making decisions in emergencies and so on? And Fabian was talking there about the Euro crisis and do whatever it takes, but then we saw, of course, what has been dubbed the EU's Hamiltonian moment with the 1.9 trillion and so on. Is this a moment of opportunity? And is it maybe, it strikes me what you are arguing is the new normal is that there is no normal. the volatility is the name of the game. So when we talk about a new normal post-COVID, there's going to be no such thing in a way. Would that be, am I understanding this correctly?
Yes, I think that, this feeling and this hope, which a lot of people have, is once we get out of the current COVID-19 crisis, which has hit us so hard and hit us in our daily lives, that we can get back to something which will be nicer, which will be normal, where we can do things which we haven't been able to do, and everything will be nice and maybe even boring, because boring can also be nice if you've been through so many crises. Exactly. But that's not how it's going to be. And that, I think, is one of the main messages we're giving. You remember in the past, we often were talking about the poly crisis, saying that, we have different crises which are linked with each other, multiple crises at the same time. But there was still this feeling that, well, at some point we'll get over that phase. But we won't. We will have probably to cope with the fact that one crisis after the other will come. They will be still linked with each other. But I think Ricardo was right here, but that doesn't mean that we should have a negative attitude in terms that we cannot do something about it. We need to prepare ourselves. There is this sense of urgency. Now, COVID-19, I think, is one of the experiences, but it's not the only experiences. Fabian was saying 15, 20 years, if you go back, if you look at the experience of the so-called Euro area crisis, if you look at the experience of the Ukraine crisis, many forget it. If you look at the experience of the so-called migration crisis, and I could go on, there are different lessons you can draw from all these, but there are also things which are very similar. So when we look back, also because you mentioned at the beginning in the context of the conference, I wouldn't only concentrate on the experience of COVID-19, I would concentrate on many crises which we had and ask ourselves, how do we prepare for the next chapters of the perma-crisis? And that has to do with emergency mechanisms when it comes to decision-making. It has to do with emergency funding, which you have in place if you get to a situation of these severe crises and you quickly need to decide. But it also, that's the last point, it also, and I think that's a big lesson from the COVID-19 crisis where we got it right, by the way, which is that once a crisis happens, that we think ourselves of what could happen if this spirals out of control.
Yeah.
That's what we did in February, March of last year. We were worried that what could happen with the consequences of COVID-19. And that's what led us in 2020 to take decisions which some even call Hamiltonian moments. I don't, but this is the kind of attitude you need to have.
Okay, Fabian wanted to jump back in, but then I want to come to you, Ricardo, about how you see potentially the role of the Conference on the Future of Europe within this. And then I see we've got a couple of questions coming in, but Fabian, you wanted to jump in.
I wanted to just emphasize the need to be better prepared. Because of course, when these crises hit, we do react, and we have managed some quite extraordinary things over the last 20 years. Things which before these crises hit were always said will be impossible, but then they become possible because the situation changes. But that's a very dangerous route to go down. It's dangerous for two main reasons. One is that it raises the whole question of legitimacy and buy-in by populations, also by political elites. Yes, you react. Yes, you do the kind of things which are necessary. But then the questions come about, was that legitimate? Do you have the legal competences to do that? And it has hurt the union that a number of people think that in some of these crises, the union has gone beyond the legal framework in addressing them. So that's one of the dangers. And the other danger is that it might not work. We might not be so lucky the next time.
Exactly.
And we should recall that in many of these crises, we were at a knife's edge. And at the time, and even if you talk to the people who were directly involved in the decisions, they did not know that it would work. And that's a very dangerous route to go down to when you're being hit by new chapters of this perma-crisis all of the time.
So hence, Ricardo, coming back to your first point when I asked about what the call to action is, your emphasis on the foresight capacity and so on. But in terms of the role of the Conference on the Future of Europe, how do you see, what can it address this issue? It's a complex issue to do with decision-making structures and so on. This isn't necessarily the sort of thing the general public can debate at any great length, but how could the Conference on the Future of Europe help to advance this discussion?
I mean, I think it can be a conversation starter on the needs to change certain things. Because I mean, if we go back to the, to the Jean Monnet famous quote that Europe will be forged, in crisis, and it will be the sum of the, the whatever of the solutions that we find. What I think it's the Conference on the Future of Europe should avoid is that let's not take another leap forward and just, to go with what Fabian was just saying and add more things to the EU without thinking what we need to stop doing. In a sense, I mean, it's a little bit that we have, I mean, sorry for that, today I'm with vegetables and fruits, but it's a little bit, it's a onion syndrome, but in reverse. Instead of peeling things that probably we shouldn't be doing anymore or that we should reform, we keep on adding, skin to the onion. I mean, it becomes unmanageable. So I think we have arrived at a time, and maybe the Conference on the Future of Europe can help do that, of self-reflection, of thinking, are we really doing the right things that we should be doing, and where can we improve, and what can maybe, let's think about of subsidiarity. Let's go back, I mean, if I can say this, to the discussions that we were having a few years ago on the white paper on the future of Europe. I mean, we still have not finished that conversation on what type of EU do we want. So I think maybe, the conference now needs really to focus on what are, I believe, the concerns of citizens, but we need to start a larger conversation about the EU and its role and its, its structures, mechanisms.
So if you like, you work from what you want to do, and then you discuss what you need to change in order to be able to meet those priorities rather than the other way around. Janis, you wanted to come in here.
Yes, I fully subscribe to what you were just saying and how you were summarizing what Ricardo said. But I think the most important thing where this notion of permanent crisis can help is the attitude you have towards the exercise, for example, of the conference. If you start from the hypothesis, you agree with the hypothesis that what actually we can expect is a state of perma-crisis in future, I think that's a different starting point from saying, oh, we'll get over this crisis and then things will be much better than they were in the past, because they won't be. So you have a different attitude to things, which I think is important. And I just want to reiterate something which Fabian said and link it to the past 12 months. Luck. We were lucky. Imagine, which is a think experiment, but I think it shows you something. Imagine we would have had the COVID crisis 1 year later. Germany would be in the midst of an electoral campaign. Chancellor Merkel's time would be running out. Do you think we would have gotten to where we got in July, in December? So if we would have, for example, a major political vacuum in one of the member states, you can be very unlucky when you are under pressure of a concrete crisis you need to deliver. So we need to do something about not getting ourselves into this potential situation. Just a little remark where I disagree a bit with Ricardo. I hope we will not have another debate about Europe's finality. We've tried that in the past. It didn't work. It doesn't lead us nowhere. It only shows that we cannot agree on what the finality should look like. So let's rather concentrate on the concrete things we need to do.
Thank you very much. Fabian, you wanted to jump in, and then I've got a couple of questions from the floor and a couple of written ones. So briefly, if you would, because we haven't got that long.
Just a couple of points. One, I think the reason why it's also very important that we keep an eye on this perma crisis is that the solutions we put into place to deal with one aspect of this perma crisis then immediately affect the other aspects. And we cannot continue to deal with these things in silos. We have to start thinking through what are the implications. I mean, clearly, when we see the whole debate at the moment about the interrelation between the geopolitics, the economics, how we deal with health, where does strategic autonomy play into this? You can see all of these different crises working together. And the danger is that if we don't address it in this kind of way, comprehensive, interlinked, dealing it with the sense of urgency which is there, that we simply are making things worse in the longer term because we're not really addressing the root causes of what is happening. And the other point, I think, is just to say it is also an important message that even when we have an immediate crisis, we need to keep the other aspects on the agenda. The climate emergency is something which needs to be on the agenda permanently because it is not something which we can afford to leave to the side because we are dealing with some other crisis.
And indeed, that is a point made by one of our questioners, Martina Kampman, who says the perma crisis is not at the same level as a crisis at economic levels. Climate and perma crisis require a change of economic and consumer patterns. So these crises are not all the same, but I think what you're talking about is mechanisms that enable you to respond to them. A comment also, and I'm going to bring it in, although we heard from him before, John Kerr, who was absolutely central in the Convention on the Future of Europe, saying the mandate was a muddle then too. It worked up to a point because three clever men, Giscard, Amato and Dahana, were determined to make it work. And he asked, is there a similar dynamo this time? And if there is, who is it? But let me, before you come back on that, Malcolm Harbour, you wanted to ask a question. Malcolm.
Well, I just wanted to put one word into the debate, which I think is a really important one, which is resilience. I think that we need to get away from phrases. I have to say, I know Janis is very fond of the perma crisis idea, but if this is going to be part of our future, then we have to build in resilience to everything that we're working on. It needs to be worked on the same level of sustainability. And there are plenty of lessons about countries who will be facing that. I've been reading a book, for example, about the way that San Francisco is preparing for the next earthquake. And 11 years ago, I visited Japan a year after the tsunami, and the effects of that are still rolling on. And these seem to be the issues that actually we need to be engaging citizens in the debate, because they need to understand that building a resilience economy is a community activity. And for the Europe is concerned, issues like energy supply and other natural disasters that might happen are also shared, because in some cases we need to share the burden better. So resilience already there, it would help.
Thank you, Malcolm. And Paul Christopherson, please. Paul.
Yes, I would just warn against continuously using the word crisis. And in fact, isn't it a contradiction in terms to talk about a perma crisis? If it is a perma crisis, it's a continuous state of affair. We have to get used to living in a world which is more unpredictable. We have to do, like Malcolm said, in a certain number of areas, be better prepared. But let's not believe that we can predict all the crises or all the unexpected situations that will pop up in the coming years. And to call the climate a crisis, we know that we have a climate situation to solve. So by saying crisis the whole time, you also give an impression of things are not possible to solve.
Thank you very much, Paul. Who would like to react to that comment? Fabian, and then Ricardo.
I think on both of the comments, I would say that when you actually look at the text we have, I think both of that is recognized. We can have an argument about what the right way of phrasing it is, but certainly the question of resilience and its ugly sister, vulnerability, I think clearly is there, because that is also one of the real drivers behind why many of these developments can turn into crisis, because we do not have the resilience in a number of places. We do have a situation where a number of places are far more vulnerable. And I think also in terms of the long-term environmental changes, that we are living in a world with uncertainty, with risk, with also more conflict. Now, we have called it a crisis. You can call it other things as well. But for me, the key point here is about how do we react to that? How do we make decisions? How do we make the right kind of processes in an environment like that?
Thank you. Ricardo, and then Janis, and then I want to ask you one last question. So briefly, if you would, Ricardo.
Very briefly, and I share as well, what Fabian just said. I mean, if and Janis would correct me. I mean, the origin of the word crisis is Greek, and it means decision, and that's for me really this is the key point. And we might be entering a period of heavy decision making, and we need to have the right tools. And what we alert also in the text is that we might not be ready for this. I mean, this is a very intense. This is a very intense period, and I think also, I mean, for citizens, I think this is fundamental. That there is to go to Malcolm Arber's words, to build societal resilience to this type of situations, but also decision makers and policy makers also needs to have this resilience. I mean, you don't only need to be knowledgeable of your files and the things that you do. You also need to be physically ready for this. Okay. This is extremely demanding. So what I'm saying is that let's start preparing for these things and start making decisions and start making them now.
Thank you. Janis, quick one if you would, and if you could also react to John Kerr's question. Do you see someone in the midst of the conference on the future of Europe who might give it, whether in a formal role or a less formal role, someone who can really drive this process to deliver, even if it is, as you said and John Kerr said, a muddle right now?
I have to start by saying something about what Paul Christopherson was saying. Aligning myself to what Ricardo was saying, the appreciation we have when we use the word permacrisis is not a negative one in the sense of we're giving up. There's nothing we can do about it. Forget us being able to prepare ourselves for the next chapters of what we call the permacrisis. We can prepare ourselves for the next chapter. And by the way, I think if we realistically assume that there will be next chapters because of this unpredictability of what is ahead of us, I think we can prepare in the right way. That was, I think, to give you an example of what happened in one of the crises of the past, 2010, in the beginning of the so-called Euro crisis, many believed that this crisis is controllable. It's only Greece. Then it was only Portugal and only Spain. It got out of control, and to be realistic, and to make the right assumptions about what potentially can happen is the right thing to do. With respect to what John was saying, obviously, if you would. John knows more about the convention than any one of us.
Indeed, he does.
But I think we should not compare, first of all, the convention and the conference. It was a different time we were living in. The aspirations were different. We were talking about working on something which would also lead to a new treaty, constitutional treaty, which it then became. We didn't get it, but still there was it became the objective. This is not what the conference is about. But the conference is even more complicated because we're now taking the citizen dimension on board. So it's even more of a complicated endeavor. And by the way, it's not going to be the last time that we're going to try something of this kind out. We don't have neither Giscard nor Amato. So we will have to operate under different circumstances. Unfortunately, I would have hoped that it would have been different. It's not the case.
Okay, last question, and I'm going to give you literally a sentence each. We've talked a lot about why we are where we are with the conference on the future of Europe and the fact that it was because people couldn't agree. We've also talked a lot in the past about how willing member states are, for example, in the area of health, to share competences, more competences at EU level and so on. If you were to try to convince an EU leaders that this is the moment in the age of what you're calling the perma-crisis, whether you accept that terminology or not, for each of you, if you were to convince member states that we need to do this in terms of foresight capacities and decision-making processes, in a sentence, an elevator pitch, if you like to use that old Americanism, Ricardo, what would you say to convince them, look, we really, really have to do this and it's in your interest to do it too? One thought from each of you.
I'll tell them a pandemic costs trillions, preparing for it costs billions.
Thank you very much. Janis.
I think I would use what we talked about earlier. I don't want to depend on luck. And we might run out of luck if we don't prepare ourselves for future crises at the right moment. So waiting for things to happen and then respond is always less smart than doing it early on. So let's not depend on luck. Yes, the EU has been very resilient over the past 10, 15 years, but we should not always assume that this will be the case all the time.
So the cost, if you don't do this, that we might not be lucky. Fabian, what would your one message to them be?
I think it would be honest. and actually say how you would explain yourself when the next crisis hits. What are you going to say to your voters, to your families, to your citizens when it comes to the next crisis and when you haven't prepared?
And on that note, gentlemen, thank you so much. I wish we had another half an hour to go on talking about it. I'm sure we will come back to it, certainly come back to the Conference on the Future of Europe. Fabian, I fear we'll come back to EU-UK many, many times. And Ricardo, the question of foresight and planning, I think, is going to feature larger and larger. So thank you to you, and thank you to all of you for joining us and watching. Just a couple of things to draw your attention to. I mentioned today publication of that commentary on the age of the permacrisis written by our guests today. There's also been already some commentaries on the Conference on the Future of Europe, lots of EPC analysts answering also people's questions about the conference, and another one Janis mentioned earlier, Mind the Gap, identifying those gaps as the EP sees them coming out, I believe either later today or tomorrow. There's also going to be a podcast which is imminent on the issue of vaccine certificates or passports next week, just to draw your attention to a new EU EPC initiative, EPC Talks Geopolitics. This is a new series and it will start with Iran's Foreign Affairs Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif on Monday morning. On Tuesday, there is a session on EU-China relations with Beijing's ambassador to the European Union, and on Thursday, national perspectives on the Conference on the Future of Europe. Lots of other things as well. Keep an eye on the website, keep an eye on your emails. I will see you back here after the next summit at the end of the month. In the meantime, it only remains for me to wish you a very pleasant rest of the day, and do stay safe. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye.